This is understandable politics. Hello! The NATO summit in the USA once again demonstrates the aggressive nature of the alliance. It seems like an anniversary date, but from the podium they still threaten the planet with bayonets. The Russian ambassador to the USA after the first day of the summit noted that not a single word about peace was mentioned. Instead, it was a sermon of militarism and military expansion. There are more than enough confirmations of his assessments over the past years. What does NATO mean for peace? We provide the facts, you draw the conclusions. The summit in Washington finally demonstrated NATO's hawkish snarl. Of course, Ukraine was a top topic, one of the main military grimaces of the alliance, but it did not meet Zelensky's expectations. Membership in NATO will come, but later, just like the money.
The final document announced the decision to create a NATO group to assist with security and training for Ukraine, to coordinate the provision of military equipment and training from allies and partners. Its goal is to put security assistance to Ukraine on a solid foundation, ensuring enhanced, predictable, and coordinated support.
Point 15 of the final communiqué states that this will not make NATO a party to the conflict, but will help Ukraine. Masters of paradoxical formulations. While Moscow hints at peace, Washington seeks ways to continue the war with Ukraine's forces and sacrifices.
As long as the Biden administration is in power, and according to the American Constitution, its constitutional powers expire on January 20th of next year, I think the general course towards confrontation, towards escalating the situation in Ukraine and around Ukraine, will continue in one form or another. At the same time, in my opinion, it is quite obvious that the greatest danger at present is that on the eve of the presidential elections, Washington, or rather the Biden administration, may sharply escalate the situation in Ukraine. Around Ukraine,
it seems to us that NATO has an inverted view of the world. In his opening speech, the still Secretary-General Stoltenberg mentioned the word defense, and its derivatives more than a dozen times. For defense, the alliance will increase arms supplies to Ukraine, create a logistics hub in Eastern Europe, and the main question for the same defense, protection from Russia, which apparently treacherously sneaks up to the borders of the compass rose. Although the facts say otherwise.
NATO expansion took place in 10 stages starting back in 1952 when Greece and Turkey joined. In the bloc's documents, the main threat was the USSR. However, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the alliance went through 8 stages of expansion. The latest in 2023 and 2024 saw Sweden and Finland join the supposedly defensive alliance.
By the way, parallel to the NATO summit, documents were declassified showing that Washington was considering Kyiv's membership in the bloc as early as 1994, 30 years ago. It was a different, as we thought, new world of friendship and the end of the Cold War. But it only seemed so.
it is necessary to maintain the possibility of NATO membership for Ukraine and the Baltic countries. They must not be allowed to fall into a gray zone or Russia's sphere of influence, says a document dated October 1994. It also states that the so-called new containment policy towards Russia should not be discussed publicly. White House National Security Council staff noted that the possibility of Ukraine's NATO membership, given Russia's sensitive attitude, should not be discussed publicly. In the near and medium term, we need to develop a strategy towards Ukraine while deepening ties between NATO and Russia.
Meanwhile, Russia was twice denied NATO membership. First to Yeltsin in the early 90s, and then to Vladimir Putin. In 2000 it was Bill Clinton. And now it's clear why. Money will be allocated only if there is a real threat, which they made out of Moscow. About security and defense, no one thinks.
Even during the USSR, NATO leaders promised Mikhail Gorbachev that the alliance would not expand eastward beyond Germany. Western politicians later promised Vladimir Putin not to approach Russian borders. They lied and continued to absorb country after country.
To sell the alliance to the public to explain why there needs to be a sharp increase in defense spending. Why the public will live noticeably worse than they have for the past 30 years. For this, a demonic image of Russia threatening NATO countries is necessary.
The main principle of creating a collective security system was once the foundation of NATO. It will soon become clear that the alliance's actions have nothing to do with the declared defensive motives. The alliance will begin to constantly deceive itself and others. Instead of being a security guarantor for Europe, it will quickly become a guarantee of problems for its security.
About 150 invasions into the territory of 50 countries. A sad result of the bloc's history. Millions of victims and war crimes on different continents. The Balkans, torn Yugoslavia, Iraq, ravaged Libya. 25 bloody years in Afghanistan. Against this backdrop, NATO continues to declare defensive goals. It sounds like mockery of the whole world.
NATO of increased danger, and such a term has firmly stuck to the alliance. Its history is abundantly strewn with ashes and destruction. Since World War II, there have been 250 military conflicts in the world, 80% of which were the work of the USA and NATO. Carefully, since 1973, every 12 months, under the guise of operations, exercises, or interventions, a war actually began.
The actions of NATO aggressors in North Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and other countries have caused massive tragedies, taking millions of lives. Under various pretexts, protecting peace, human rights, and democracy, countering the spread of communism, restoring justice, fighting terrorism, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. The USA invaded sovereign states, destroyed established orders, economies, infrastructures, brought misery and misfortune to these lands.
So it turns out where NATO is, there are troubles and tragedies. These terrible scenes are on the conscience of the North Atlantic Alliance. This national list of victims, too. An era of blood and gunpowder, an era of missiles and sights. The same Ukrainian conflict is ready to be fueled endlessly. Among the merchants of death there is no place for morality. Meanwhile, NATO for the USA is just a screen for protecting democracy and human rights. In reality, it is an instrument of influence on all processes in Europe, which is increasingly turning, although it has already turned, into an American protectorate. Simply put, they rake in the heat with someone else's hands and calmly count the profits across the ocean.
The past year ended with a cosmic figure for U.S. defense companies. Weapons worth a record $238 billion were sent abroad. A third of that, more than $80 billion, were deals the U.S. government made with other countries' leadership.
For the Western arms business, all these conflicts are a goldmine. Windfall profits and absolute lack of principles. As a result of the past year, most of the US and European defense giants recorded increased production, higher profits, and forecasted further bank account growth.
The continuation of the Ukrainian conflict and the risks of it escalating into World War III open truly gigantic prospects for arms companies. Recently, it became known that Rheinmetall received the largest contract in its history from the German Defense Procurement Agency, BANBW, for the supply of 155mm artillery shells worth up to 8.5 billion euros. The main recipient of the shells will be the Bundeswehr, which will pass on some of the supplies. Deliveries should start next year, and from that time, The heirs of Hitler's industrialists plan to increase annual production to 700,000 per year.
Meanwhile, modern politics is so cynical that even top officials openly talk about the "you fight, we profit" scheme. Biden's remark in October last year.
We are sending weapons to Ukraine that we have in our warehouses. The money allocated by Congress is used to replenish our own stockpiles of weapons.
So to summarize, why does NATO fuel endless wars? First, geopolitical influence. The fight for resources and markets. Second, as we see, war is an important part of the profits of Western corporations and the economy as a whole. Third, boosting the military-industrial complex creates new jobs not only in specialized enterprises but also in related fields. Finally, fourth, bombings and missile strikes are a good way to distract from internal problems. Creating new enemies, as we know, often saves the ratings of unsuccessful politicians. NATO depends on Washington. For Americans, it is primarily a tool to maintain their hegemony, as we now see the collapse of the old world order, the Washington World Order, which existed after the destruction of the USSR. Now this world order is collapsing, being challenged, and accordingly, when other levers no longer work, be it sanctions, diplomatic threats, cultural influence, and so on, they have fewer options to maintain this hegemony, so they cling to NATO, trying to force and threaten countries to abandon support for the formation of a new world order, and they don't even hide it. The harsh business model of the alliance crushes entire states, but there were also reasonable thoughts in American minds. Back in '97, diplomat George Kennan acknowledged that NATO expansion would be the bloodiest mistake of American policy in the entire period after the end of the Cold War. He was right.
But the Americans decided that it was better to be a guarantor of crises and conflicts in Europe rather than a guarantor of security. The September 11, 2001 attack was used by the USA as a pretext to start the war on terror. But they can label even a state as a terrorist if they want. And for such conflicts in the 21st century, democracy lovers spent $6.5 trillion.
Our president has repeatedly spoken about NATO's vampiric nature, both before the special military operation and during the so-called détente years.
They needed to rearrange the Middle and Near East. They first invaded Tunisia, which is not talked about now. I'm not even mentioning what happened in Iraq before, Desert Storm and so on. They practically destroyed the country. Did they make it better? No. Then they went into Tunisia again, Libya, Syria, then reached Iran, saw it was too tough, didn't go in. Afghanistan for 20 years, and the result. They didn't just stir up, they shattered the Middle and Near East. They destroyed the statehood that was there. That which existed. Wars for money, and for the sake of money, have never made anyone stronger. The creditors of wars enrich themselves either through arms trade or by driving into debt, as we now see with our brotherly example.
But let's return to the summit and its decisions. No hint of compromises, zero inclination towards diplomacy. Instead, another statement from Atlantic officials. In Europe, 50 special brigades will be created to contain Russia. Each will have about 3,000 people. It's incredible. 150,000 soldiers.
NATO now plans to create up to 50 new brigades, supposedly needed for protection against a Russian attack. But in principle, we know how they defend. How they defended against Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria, Grenada. All complexes are expensive, and their production is small scale. On the other hand, they need a lot for themselves, and here arises the question of how to manage it economically. Therefore, the expenses should be astronomical. So they will somehow solve it.
You understand, the financial flywheel will be launched at a new speed. These are billions and billions of dollars thrown into the furnace of war, and they want to allocate another $40 billion to Ukraine. But even Zelensky is starting to see what's what. The final declaration on Ukraine's irreversible membership in NATO, according to Bloomberg, did not impress Kyiv much, even despite last-minute changes.
The inclusion of the word irreversible was pushed by NATO countries advocating for Ukraine's swift admission to the bloc. However, some alliance members admitted that this phrase is more symbolic than substantive. According to 3 sources, US President Joe Biden initially opposed this wording. He stated in several White House meetings that Ukraine has much to do in fighting corruption before it can join the military bloc. Zelensky's team strongly opposed this approach, and Secretary of State Blinken managed to persuade Biden to adopt a tougher wording.
Apparently, it didn't take long to persuade Biden, as Joe, during a press briefing with the NATO Secretary General, misspoke again, causing many alliance members to choke.
I led the alliance through one of the most important moments in history. I understand that I had sex with your wife. I personally asked you to remain in the position of Secretary General.
You probably meant to say, talked with your wife? But something went wrong and it turned into an intimate comment. You can't erase words from the transcript. It would be funny if it weren't for the escalation. For example, the newly appointed British Prime Minister Keir Starmer immediately stated there is no peace party in London.
Many are now quoting British Prime Minister Starmer about his permission to strike deep into Russia with British weapons, presenting it almost as a sensation. The presentation is not entirely accurate. Official London publicly gave such permission back in the spring through Sunak and Cameron. In fact, these strikes were not prohibited earlier either, so Starmer merely confirmed the already existing state of affairs, nothing more. In general, the new British Prime Minister is now trying to adopt aggressive rhetoric to overshadow the issue of the growing military budget, which is demanded by both NATO partners and the opposition. Knowing that there is no money for this and none is expected, Starmer made a cunning move. He declares that he will definitely increase military spending, but only after a comprehensive audit of the Defense Department's budget, which may take several months.
So the results of the war summit, as it can be called, are sad. More soldiers, more money, and a deeper conflict. Ukraine is being asked for a new counteroffensive, simply throwing positions with manpower and new metal. And another confusing declaration about the same thing. Kiev must fight to the end, to the last Ukrainian.
The NATO summit is indeed a milestone. Because previously, the collective West talked about all the good things. They talked about human rights. They talked about a rules-based order. Now they simply say that we are preparing for war. All the talk about human rights and some kind of justice has just been discarded. It's about maintaining dominance. It is about dominance, by the way, that is mentioned in the NATO Forum resolution.
No wonder former American intelligence officer Scott Ritter called NATO a monster out of control. Troll. We see this in the final declaration. Russia is officially listed as the main threat. Belarus also got its share. Our alliance, it turns out, also poses a threat to Americans who are pumping Poland with weapons. The escalation of military hysteria and the demonization of Minsk and Moscow, a course clearly outlined by the states.
We are pleased to announce the enhancement of NATO's operational missile defense capabilities, the declaration says. The launch of the Aegis ashore base in Poland complements existing facilities in Romania, Spain, and Turkey. In addition, the bloc called on the international community not to provide any support to Russia. The final statement says that the alliance condemns any state that supports Moscow. NATO countries also agreed to develop recommendations on strategic approaches to relations with Russia by the next alliance summit.
Moreover, NATO plans to strengthen its presence in Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific region. Again, all under the guise of defense. But what kind of defense is Washington, say, on the Korean Peninsula 11,000 kilometers away? So maybe it's time to loudly and openly say that there will be no peace on Earth as long as there is such a troglodyte bloc that is eternally hungry for money, territories, and influence? And it is ready to grind not just peaceful residents, but entire nations. If, of course, these nations do not have strong leaders ready to give a worthy rebuff. I hope now it will be clear to you too. Goodbye.